Friday night, the Kansas Legislative Research Department released its schedule for the House and Senate committees listening tour, which gives citizens the chance to give input on the redistricting process that happens every decade with new census data. When redistricting last happened in 2011, these meetings were spread over 4 months. By contrast, this year, they've crammed 14 stops into just 5 days, all before the census data has even been released. Many have criticized this move, including the Kansas League of Women Voters, who put out a press release expressing disappointment and saying they're concerned about the announcement. Here with me today, I have Mary Galligan with the Kansas League of Women Voters. How are you doing today, Mary?
I'm just great. Thank you.
Awesome. I'm glad to hear that. First off, I just thought it was such a powerful statement, and it seems like your organization really wanted to react to this. Can you tell me more about your concerns with the scheduling of this event and why you felt that the need to put out that press release?
Sure, Jesse. Well, I first need to say that the League is really glad the committees chose to continue the tradition of holding hearings across the state in preparation for redistricting. The League, at its heart, supports broad participation in public policymaking. That's who we are. And any concerns that we have about the schedule or other arrangements for the hearings are those things that might get in the way of public participation. So, for example, having all the hearings scheduled during the same week, as you mentioned, with very short notice, makes it difficult for members of nonpartisan grassroots organizations like the League to participate. Our members aren't professional lobbyists, so can't be prepared to present testimony at the drop of a hat. Also, since most of the hearings are scheduled during the day, working people may not be able to participate. Right now, only 4 of the 14 meetings are going to be in the evening. Another potential problem is the short meetings and the fact that people will not be assured of any particular amount of time. There's an announcement on the KLRD website saying that the chair may reduce people's speaking time if necessary. That onus may itself discourage participants. Not knowing how much time you have for your remarks makes it difficult for community members to who aren't used to speaking in public to get ready. Imagine having put time and effort into developing your testimony, being very careful to check all your facts and to verify all your examples, and having practiced your presentation, then to be told when you get up to the podium that you can't make your presentation, but instead must summarize it. It's very discouraging. Finally, there were some bobbles and problems initially with some of the addresses on the public schedule, and the instructions for submitting written testimony have changed since they were originally published. And corrections and changes have been made, and we applaud that being done the week before the hearings start. But there wasn't much notice of those changes. So what the League has had to do is have volunteers, and I'm sure other community organizations have had to do this too, sort of keep an eye on the research department's website and convey changes to their members as necessary. In situations where information is not pretty solid, I think especially with the kind of uncertainty we've got in our public life broadly right now, we're a little bit afraid that a level of confusion might also dampen participation, and that participation is our key.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. And it seems like there's a couple or even several kind of issues with the way that this was rolled out, just between, and you made a great point too, and several good points of, it sounds like even like some of the expectations or rules aren't clearly defined. You mentioned, and I knew that this was an issue too, that some of the locations that were listed initially weren't even accurate. So people might be going to the wrong spot or not even knowing where exactly to go. And all that is exasperated because the announcement of the meetings and the meetings themselves are in such close to session. One of the things that you mentioned in your press release, though, was in 2011 that this process took place over a series of months. I think it was like July to into October. So that's, I mean, a much longer period of time and not a single week like it is this time. Why is that important, the difference in timelines?
Well, it really has a little bit to do with the ability of us as human beings to absorb information. Redistricting is a kind of an obscure topic, in part only because it's done once a decade.
Mm-hmm.
And it really involves a fairly steep learning curve for both legislators and the public. It seems to us that spreading the initial hearings and the associated learning process out over a reasonable length of time can allow everyone to absorb the information. That will have a positive feedback loop. The better members of the public understand the issues and the technicalities, the more they're able to provide meaningful information to the committees. Time between hearings, quite frankly, allows understanding to grow. There's another advantage, if you will, of having hearings spread out a little bit, and that is that the publicity, the buzz, for one hearing can help increase interest in the following hearings. It's possible that with the current schedule, the benefit of cumulatively increasing public awareness will be lost.
That's such a good point too. I'm curious because it seems like a relatively mathematical process. What type of input are people looking for, or like the legislators looking for during this process? And how do they use the public input to better the redistricting process?
Well, I think your comment that it's a mathematical process goes to the technicalities.
I could, yeah.
And probably we can accurately anticipate that these hearings are not going to be map drawing workshops. That's a whole different thing.
That's even sure.
But in the past, people have come to these hearings and described their communities of interest. They've identified areas that they, as members of that community, think need to stay whole in one district in order to be well represented. So there could be, I don't know, neighborhood revitalization areas that really feel that they need to stay in one representative district so they can work closely with the representatives who may be very important in helping them keep a funding stream going for that project. That's just one example. Some conferees actually have come to the hearings in the past with full dress proposals for districts. Now, I would say that's going to be somewhere between darn difficult and impossible this round because as the Census Bureau has been announcing since last spring, they will not have the detailed census numbers to the legislatures until August 16th. So these hearings just precede receiving those detailed numbers. So I really don't look to see very many serious full map proposals at the hearings this time, but there could be some. Some conferees talk to the committees in these hearings about difficulties they've had because of the configuration of existing districts, especially those that span natural features like rivers or that span communities that have very little in common. And that's that community of interest information gets sort of woven into the sort of the whole milieu of how then the committees and individual legislators look at district proposals.
Interesting. Well, and it's so interesting. It's and it seems to be maybe one of the concerns generally about the process is that the census data won't be available for any of the meetings this year, right? And one of the things, again, kind of contrasting the last time that we went through this proposal. It sounds like last time there were 2 meetings before the census data was available, but the bulk of the meetings happened after that data was released. And it seems like, I mean, the census data is kind of the precursor to the whole process. So it seems like that might be important to have to fully discuss redistricting. And so I guess part of that question too is, given some of the abrupt the scheduling and the fact that the census data won't even be available, as you talk about citizen participation in this process, how do you have any fears that they might not be receptive, or how receptive do you think they might be to input during this process?
Well, our hope is certainly that the committees and other members of the legislature are holding these hearings as a sincere attempt to an expression of their desire to listen to Kansans and to create new districts based on their perspectives. I suppose there's some possibility that, a scenario could play out where there'd be an attempt maybe to discount what was heard at these hearings simply because of the timing. But I think we have to assume that this is a sincere good faith effort to gather information. Sure. And frankly, the difficulty of not having the census data is that some of the comments, some of the information the legislators will be able to receive that might otherwise be helpful might be less helpful, right, simply because people don't have a level of precision with which to express their desires.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that I think is exactly what we're talking about in some ways, of like just limiting the information that you have as you present as a citizen. So does that speak to any other? I know you said that we have to presume that this is a good faith and sincere effort. Do you have other fears about the redistricting process, though?
Well, as a nonpartisan organization, the League sort of a standing fear. It's our, I guess it's a fear, a point that we're concerned whenever there's a possibility that partisan considerations will result in districts in which many Kansans are not able to elect candidates of their choice. Mm-hmm. I mean, ultimately, this map drawing is to result in fair elections, and that's the thread of fairness in process and in execution that goes literally from the ground to the chamber in which the decision makers sit. Related to that, of course, and equally important is our concern that racial gerrymandering will have the same impact that will block Black and Brown communities from being able to elect candidates of their choice. Mm-hmm. And then we always have the fear that there's a perception that elections are foregone conclusions, and that discourages members from even filing for office. Sure. So there's this drumbeat of fairness goes through every step of the process. The suppression of competition for offices limits the choices voters have. The perception of fairness is fundamental to our system, and it's key to everything that happens in public policy making. So it's sort of like it starts on the ground level, literally, because we're talking about dividing up bits of geography, mm-hmm. and it goes all the way up to through our electoral and representation processes.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting too. And again, people might be coming to this with different understandings of the redistricting process and even the stakes of it. Not everyone even totally understands the outcome, because this ultimately decides, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mary, both the U.S. House district, I know is part of this, but as well as the Kansas state district as well.
Good reminder to me, Jesse. Yes, we are talking at everything I've talked about here is about the redistricting that the Kansas legislature will do, which will involve creating districts for our 4-member congressional House of Representatives delegation and the 165 members in the Kansas House and Senate, as well as the State Board of Education. So really the legislature draws 4 maps in this process, and we'll need to get that done during the upcoming 2022 legislative session.
So speaking to that, just to tie the thread together, so even during these meetings, which are, were they 90 minutes? Is that right? Or not even quite, right? Like hour 15. They're talking about not just one map of 4 maps, and also during the course of all of these meetings, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Presumably, members of the public would speak to concerns they have or things they want to bring to the legislator's attention in any one of those 4 district maps. Yes.
Yeah. So it just I think goes to the point of it feels a little bit cramped. It feels like there's a lot. That's a lot. 4 maps, 14 meetings, 5 days. Like that just feels really cramped. And I think part of the concern and part of what maybe people have heard or are more likely to kind of understand is this is part of a bigger national conversation, because this isn't just happening in Kansas. This is happening across the country. And when you talk about being a nonpartisan organization, but having concerns about partisan, interest influencing this process, that's one of the things I know that can result is that one party or one organization or whatever, one group can have outsized influence by basically squashing the influence that others should have. What are some of the other outcomes or potential downfalls to an unfair process here?
Well, I think especially based on the experience we had 10 years ago when ultimately the federal court drew the districts because the legislature was unable to reach an agreement. There's that nagging fear again for people who are involved in deeply, intimately involved in encouraging people to run for office and to vote. That fear that a protracted process will interfere with sort of a smooth preparation for the 2022 election. You only have to talk to any election commissioner or county clerk across the state who's in charge of administering elections to learn what the whole once the districts are drawn and approved and that's a done deal, the redistricting is done, then those election administration officials have one heck of a job getting everything set up for that election, because everything about every election we hold in this state that's electing people for single member districts, which is what we're talking about here, has to be lined up correctly so people get the correct ballot, so that people know where their polling place is. All of those things, there's a cascading effect in election administration that comes out of this process. Fortunately, only once every 10 years. But so if the time isn't allowed, then we go into the next election cycle on sort of wobbly legs.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think you set the table perfectly. Like, this is foundational to appropriate representation for Kansans. So to that point, I know that next week already we are starting the meetings. We have shared those meeting dates and locations. I'm sure your organization has to, but just giving anyone listening to this just a flag to go look for those. Would you encourage people to attend the meetings?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That felt like the softball. I felt like you were going to say yes to that one.
Yeah.
But more, and even, yeah, exactly. But even more than that, like if well, I'll even tell you, I am considering, well, I'm going to one of the meetings, and I am, even as a member of an organization that's representing and part of this conversation, even I am a little bit like, so what am I supposed to ask or say, or what exactly should I do? So I'm sure many other people that might be considering it are having the same questions. What would you tell them?
I think that's a great question, and part of the reason we so loudly, in our own little way, encourage people to attend these hearings and to participate in this process is because most Kansans don't have an opportunity to see and take part in policymaking directly. This is one of those rare opportunities. It only unfolds once every 10 years, but it unfolds in the world of policymaking over a relatively short period of time. So from the time we get the census numbers until the end of the upcoming session. In the world of policymaking, that's kind of like a nanosecond. So we really encourage participants in the hearings to talk about their communities and the degree to which those communities feel represented well in the legislature and in Congress. Again, those are really the two bodies we're talking about in this round. Excuse me, my cord caught. Kansans should speak frankly to the committees about the number of uncontested elections they've had in their communities and what that has done to voter participation. That's a fairly good indicator that maybe there's something that can be done to make the districts more lively, if you will. And even with the number of variables there are in terms of influencing people to participate in electoral politics. And in terms of the process, we really are encouraging Kansans to talk more, to talk a lot, and to ask for more and easier ways to participate in the process, especially once maps are introduced. Kansans should have ample opportunity to weigh in on those maps before the committees push them forward into the House and Senate. And that's one little bit of civics lesson here. The legislative and congressional and state board of education redistricting plans are acted on by the legislature as bills. So they go through essentially the same process any bill does. So introduced in the House, introduced in the Senate, cross over to the other chamber, are considered by that chamber, and then if approved in different form, they would go to a conference committee and then be approved and go to the governor to be signed. In the case of legislative districts, the Supreme Court has one final review before they're used for those 2022 elections. But there should be time built into that process, notwithstanding what I said a minute ago about this just being a nanosecond. There should be time built into this so people can react to the maps that are getting serious consideration in the legislative process.
Yeah. So just, I think that's so funny because when you talk about a political nanosecond, it's quick, but still, you're saying still like accessible, and there's still time to get involved. You're right in that line of don't be afraid of that, be encouraged by that it's not a super long process.
Exactly.
When you talk about your organization being all about participation, it occurred to me as you talked and how the effects of this process can lead to fairer elections. You talk about uncontested elections and how demoralizing and how not participatory that is. You mentioned earlier the idea of candidates not wanting to potentially run because they think it's a foregone conclusion. So by participating in this process, people can create more participation down the road. It's kind of participation here begets participation later. Would that be accurate?
Well, that's certainly what our model of sort of continual participation is based on, and yes, and I think that speaks to, you know, one, healthy engagement with the decision-making, policy-making process does beget another, and that's the kind of virtuous cycle we want to see established.
And on that note, I just want to ask you again, because I want to make sure that people could have some ideas or some takeaways of what they can do if they're interested in this conversation and in this kind of work. Are there other opportunities for people to get involved, either in redistricting or even looking beyond that? Is there anything else you would encourage people to look for?
Well, yes, absolutely. And this is going to sound like I'm sort of beating a drum here, but during this round of redistricting, if people are interested in this process and what's happening, in addition to staying in contact with legislative leadership and the redistricting committees, your own House member and senator who represent the district you currently live in are going to be involved in this process. Each and every legislator will vote, or will have an opportunity to vote, sure, on bills in their respective chambers. They will be involved in this, and they are important. So even, and I would say, if your member sort of says, well, I'm not on the committee, I'm just sort of waiting, waiting for leadership to tell me what to do, whatever the story is, I would say have a little chat with them about what you're concerned about, so they have that in mind when those bills are presented, when they get a chance to review those maps, and tell them you'd like to see those maps when they're unveiled. Beyond this round of redistricting, the League has a long-term goal of moving redistricting to an independent commission in order to mitigate some of the partisan pressure on map makers. The League has advocated that approach for many years. We think it will be more fair than the current situation, and we can use all the help we can get in that effort. In speaking to some of my fellow Leaguers, I have reminded them that we can't burn out on this round of redistricting because we've got a 9-year campaign facing us. But whether it's redistricting or any other policy matter, our message is really the same. Stay involved with your elected representatives at all levels. City councils also will be drawing districts if they elect from single member districts. School districts will be drawing new internal districts if they elect from single member districts. So the learning that will happen here goes all up and down our levels of jurisdiction. So stay involved with your elected representatives at all levels. Stay connected both as individuals and as members of civic organizations. And finally, I guess I would be a very poor leaguer if I didn't say, register, study the issues and the candidates, and vote.
I love it. That's I think the perfect note to end on. Mayor Galligan from the Kansas League of Women Voters, thank you so much for joining me here today.
Thank you.